let's go.
All right, well, welcome everybody to our kickoff seminar of the fall quarter here. My name is Janine Zacharia. I'm the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in the Department of Communication. And I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to interview my friend and colleague, Jim Tankersley, about his new book, The Riches of this Land. Here is the story of what went wrong and how to get it back. Jim is a Stanford alum, I believe, class of 2000, and now a star economics reporter at the New York Times. He's also an Oregon native and just spent several days covering the devastating fires back in his home state of Oregon before rushing back to fact check the debate last night. And I'm wondering, Jim, if we can talk about which of those was more challenging of an assignment in a little bit. But this is an incredible book, and I felt, Jim, like you were Virgil leading me through a monetary and fiscal policy and a morass of academic papers, making them riveting, so I couldn't wait to hear what was going to be in the academic paper. And you did this by bringing them to life with clear, crisp narrative writing, which of course is my favorite thing in the world. Single character narratives that just really sing to illustrate what has happened to the middle class since its boom in the post-World War II era. And it's also a passionate, I felt, polemic of sorts. You call out a lot of BS in this book. You do some very interesting reporter mea culpas about the 2016 election. And you prescribe remedies for the nation's ills, all in like a tight, 250 pages or so. So congratulations. And I wanted to say, as one of the instructors who teach Com 104 right now, the reporting, writing, and understanding the news at Stanford, that I was particularly moved by your shout out to your mentor, Bill Wu, who Professor Glasser, who may be on the call or joining us, described once as the backbone of the journalism program at Stanford, who passed away in 2006. So I know that he would be incredibly proud of you for this wonderful work. So before we dive in, I wonder, because I'm a journalist still too, I kind of have to lead off the news. And I want to get to all those aspects of the book we described, really explain the economics that you and your very interesting thesis, and also the journalism aspects, because I see that there are a bunch of journalism students on the call. I wonder if we could just kick off with your reaction to last night's debate and having also to have that inauspicious role of having to fact check it in real time.
Fact checking in real time is always hard, but I think fact checking what felt like a demolition derby in real time is particularly difficult. And in the first part, I was bummed because there wasn't a lot of economic policy in the first half an hour. And then I started to get worried that they were going to start talking about economic policy, and I was going to have to deal with the fire hose and the crazy half statements. And so it was a challenge. I think that it's a challenging moment for us right now as journalists in general, to be candid, because there's so much information floating around that we feel like we have to correct. And it's all you can do to say things like, no, actually, Donald Trump did not cause the recession. COVID caused the recession. He may have made it worse, but he didn't cause it, which was one of my fact checks. Or no, it's not true that Ohio had its best year ever when Donald Trump was in office. That's just not true. And here are all these reasons. So it's one thing just to do that, and then it's another to try to figure out, well, do we even weigh in on sort of the spirit of what they're saying here, or their back and forth? I mean, Donald Trump saying, I paid millions of dollars in taxes in 2017, when the New York Times has obtained copies of his taxes where he paid $750. I mean, it's just, it is a really challenging moment. So I can't say that I enjoyed it, to be super honest, but I can say that I did come away at the end feeling like, maybe the people who were reading along with the fact checks were trying to get some policy out of that debate, and possibly reading fact checks gave you more policy than the candidates did.
Well, maybe we can circle back to this question of how to cover Trump a little bit later, but I really do want to, he sucks up a lot of oxygen in a lot of these different forms, and I want to talk about the book, and we're going to get to Trump. I want to remind those who are joining us that if I'm going to be interviewing Jim, I've got plenty of questions, but if something occurs to you as we're chatting that you want to ask him, please write it in the chat box. And my colleague, Mark Dezzuti, is periodically going to email me so I can see them, and I will try to fold your questions into the conversation. So you kicked this off, Jim, really fast in the prologue about what this book is about. Let me just read from the opening. This is a story about the greatest middle class in human history, how it was built more than half a century ago, and how America could rebuild it today from the ruins of historic economic collapse. Its heroes are Black men, immigrants, and women of all races. They are the key to restoring prosperity that is broadly shared among all workers and not confined largely to the rich and elite. Talk us about what you mean here. Why are Blacks, women, and immigrants key to restoring the prosperity to all workers, including the white working class workers?
Thank you so much. First off, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be at a Stanford event, and I have loved getting to keep this connection with Stanford over the years of my journalism career, and I love being here and talking with you now. And it's a great question because this is the theme of the book. This is why I wrote this book. In more than 2 decades now as a full-time professional reporter, and in more than a decade as being a full-time economics reporter, I've spent, so much time chasing this elusive question of what's gone wrong for the American middle class, and we can talk about how I got to that question in a second. But this is the answer. I mean, I do 2 really important things, I think, every day in my reporting. I read deep academic research on economics, and I try to talk to real people. And this book fuses those 2 things and makes an argument about who are the important workers for the American middle class, and who are how do we empower them to revive this middle class that has stagnated over the last few decades. So, journalistically, actually, the opening line is sort of a brick through the window, basically giving the entire book away. And I didn't really want to do that, but my editor, this is the tension with editors, as you know, Janine. I wanted a narrative lead, which ends up being the opening.
You went to New Yorker, where you get to the point at page 37.
Yeah, I wanted to open with what is the first chapter now in the book. This is what you just read us from the prologue, and I wanted to open with the story of these women in a tobacco factory in North Carolina, which is amazing, just amazing stuff. But no, my editor was really insistent, we need to give people a reason to read this book right away. And so, I feel good about it now. Sometimes, occasionally, editors are right. And in this case, I felt like, it works to tell people, this is a book about the middle class. You've read lots of books about the middle class. You've heard lots of books about the middle class. This one's different. This one is not just about distressed white men in factory states across the Midwest. This is a story about the people who actually have been the unsung heroes of our middle class over the last century, and I'm going to tell you why. And so that is the both the tease and the reveal right away at the start.
So we'll keep talking about the main argument of that. Actually, it's Blacks, Latinos, and immigrants that are going to power any recovery. But then again, I don't know if the editor made you do this, but you're just so blunt. You write about how in your reporting on this for 2 decades, you uncovered, quote, lies that have poisoned our national debate for decades. Politicians have, quote, peddled an incomplete origin story for the middle class. And so just talk about what is the key lie that they've been peddling and that maybe they continue to peddle till today.
Yeah, they still are. The great lie that is sold to American workers and has been sold really since before we were even a country is the idea that the greatest threat to workers like you, working class worker, is workers who don't look like you. So if you are a white man, the greatest threat is women, or it's Black men, or it's immigrants. And time again, this has been an incredibly effective political tactic in American history to divide one group of workers against another. And who ends up winning from that? It's the elite white men. It's always white men. It has been from the get-go, who run the country and who run the economy. And my argument, the argument of this book is that's wrong. It's actually wrong that the economy is a zero-sum game in which some groups of workers are pitted against the other. The economy actually does best when all groups of workers get ahead, when opportunity opens for everyone, and in particular, when people who have been held back and not allowed to do the things that they would be best at, to achieve their full potential in the country and in the economy. When they're allowed to do that, it creates the conditions that raise everyone up. It makes the economy grow faster. It makes incomes rise faster. It is the sort of magic formula. And in a very nerdy economic way, it's a productivity argument, but in a much more like high-minded way, it's an argument about human potential, and it's just a deep faith in people, which I've always had, but which the economic research is really clear on, that this lie is effective politically but ineffective economically, and a big reason why I wrote this book was to try to defeat it.
So if this lie is really a lie, okay, that projecting that working America as white and male is under siege from outsiders, however you want to define that. If the truth economically is that, no, you need to lift everybody up, okay? Why would they peddle the lie? Why are they continuing? If it's not good for their bottom line, why is that still a problem?
Well, I think there's two reasons. The first is that it's really easy to talk yourself and other people into the idea that it's true, that there's some competition at the lower end for a finite number of jobs. And if you think about it, like first off, keeping workers disempowered is a very good tactic for political domination of a system and also economic domination. It's harder, when workers aren't banded together and demanding things, you can play them off against each other and pay them less and minimize their interests in legislatures and everything else. But it's also easy to talk yourself into it. You can say, listen, I'm better off, guy who runs the country, guy who runs the company, if I have sets of workers basically competing for what for my finite pool of jobs. Whereas, to sort of like give a preview of what the big argument is here, when you just open up opportunity and let people do what they're best at, you are essentially creating a lot of competition for the companies and that are already in place and the people who run the country, because you are creating more opportunities. You're creating an expanding pool of jobs, companies, businesses, everything, and that ends up creating more economic growth and all the good stuff that comes after that.
So, in your core thesis, you have this idea that reducing discrimination against women and minorities, it was key to this great middle class expansion. Of all the wonderful stories that you tell, which is the anecdote that we could share with the group that really illustrates that point for you?
I think there's so many. I actually think, if you don't mind, just to very quickly tell the story of how I learned the middle class story. I think this is instructive because I think so many people have learned it this way. Yeah. When I was a kid growing up in rural Oregon, largely white high school, the way we learned about the post-war era was a very Leave It to Beaver story. White men coming home from the war who then went to work in the suburbs or lived in the suburbs, went to work in the cities, wearing their suits and ties, and powered America in a post-war economy to this massive expansion of the middle class. Everybody moves to California. Everybody gets a car. And it's true, we had this massive expansion of the middle class in those decades after the war. But what we didn't learn was the role, in my school in particular, but I think in most schools, was the role that other workers played in this expansion. There was an enormous influx of women into the American labor force, both during the war and then in the decades following it. From 1950 to 1980, there's almost 30 million women who joined the labor force. That's just an enormous amount of work coming into the country. And then women are allowed to start doing things they weren't allowed to do before. If you wanted to be a medical professional, you were kind of capped for the most part at being a nurse until the 60s, until the hard work of civil rights come along and start breaking down barriers and allow you to be someone who can be a doctor. And the same is true for Black men who have been held back forever. From all, if they were told you can only be a custodian at this law firm, not an actual lawyer, and then finally they start to break through as well. Those are people whose potential, when unleashed, just made the U.S. economy a lot more productive. It turns out when you put your best players in the positions where they can be most effective, you just have a much better team. And that is in a horrible sports metaphor way, exactly what happened to the economy.
Analogy, I like it.
Yeah. So the story that really encapsulates this for me, I mean, my favorite character by far in the book is my friend Ed Green and his family. And Ed is a guy who's in his 60s. He lives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I met him several years ago on a sort of a warm September night in a baseball park where he was starting his second full-time job of the day. In the mornings, Ed gets up and he lays tar on the highway for the state of North Carolina. And in the evenings, he was a janitor for baseball teams and an usher for basketball, Wake Forest basketball and football teams in the other seasons. And now he works at a liquor store in the evenings. But Ed did that because that's how he needed to work two jobs to provide a middle-class life for his family. But Ed had grown up middle class, and he'd actually had a middle class job before he had to leave New York City because his mom was sick and he needed to move back to where she was from in Winston-Salem. And his family turns out to be this incredible encapsulation of the American middle class story. Black family in Winston-Salem. His mom and his dad moved to New York in the 60s, and they move in the 50s, have children in the 60s, and they go on to get these jobs that were not available to Black people even 20 years before in America. His mom's a telephone operator, his dad's a plumber, and they do really amazing things for their family, and they build a Black middle class in Queens. And it's not just good for them that they were able to do that. It's good for the whole country. So they're this sort of incredible illustration. And Ed, who I've gotten to know a lot over the last several years, and his work ethic are an incredible encapsulation, I think, of what the economy is doing right now to the people who should be thriving and doing better, but are being held back by all sorts of impediments that we have thrown up for these very important workers.
I mean, it's such a powerful scene. You're there. I don't want to give it away, but I might give just this one scene away because you have great scenes to spare in this book where you're at, what was it, a minor league baseball game that night with your son, and you see your friend go down. He's got to go onto the field to pick up all the shells, right, that the white spectators have thrown. And doesn't your son say something like, "Dad, don't throw that," right? Tell that story. I mean, it was so...
I mean, it's, Ed, my son is, my son, I think, was 7 at the time that we went down there and met Ed. Or he had, anyway, he was a young man, and it just, we have this tradition where at the end of every summer we go to see a minor league baseball game. And we went down to this particular game to see and meet Ed. And Ed taught Max, my son, that you can't spill the Pepsi on the concrete because it's really hard to get Pepsi out of concrete. So Max was like, "Dad, don't spill the Pepsi." But he was young and not used to staying up for an entire baseball game, but we did. We stayed for the whole game, and the game ends and there's fireworks afterwards, and Max is tired, and we watched the fireworks because it's the last game of the season. And then as we're walking out of the stadium, we turn and look back, and Ed, who earlier in the day had been honored by the team as its employee of the year, Ed is still hanging around at the stadium while all these white fans file out. And there's Ed picking up spent firecracker shells off the field. And he was there for hours, he told me later, just because he needed to get it all done. And that's what he does. He gets work done and never complains about it, and is an amazing example of the American worker today.
Race is very powerful in this book, I think, from the beginning for you, and racial discrimination and how that is a barrier to reclaiming this sort of golden period success that you describe. I was thinking about it last night during the debate when there was that, I think there was some discussion, it was very hard, there was a lot of yelling, but about the racial sensitivity training and the president arguing against that. And I just wondered, what your thoughts were on that, just because race is so powerful in this book for you. And there's a lot of if you're going to, there's a line somewhere in there, Jim, about if you're going to blame anyone for your hardship, blame me, blame the white men who are, it's not only Washington, it's white men in particular. Can you just talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the argument of the book, which again comes out of research, including some from two of the authors of the sort of foundational paper that animates this book are Stanford professors, really boils down to the idea that reducing discrimination unleashed an enormous productivity boom in the U.S. economy, and we still have a lot of discrimination. I mean, that is, and the wild thing to me about our debate in America in 2020 is that we're not debating that debate last night was not about how do we best reduce the discrimination that plagues Black communities in America. One of the questions was, do you believe systemic racism is a thing?
Right.
And I mean, it's just on the one hand shocking that we are still in a place as a country where this is a debatable topic. There's, for people who care about empirical evidence, there is a ton of it that racism exists, that outcomes and opportunities are not anywhere close to equal for non-white Americans compared to white Americans, and for women compared to men. I mean, it's just, racism and sexism exist, and it's indisputable. But there is a lot of dispute, and I think that what really struck me about that exchange last night, which devolved into like 15 different shouting matches, was just that first question. And they had a debate about race that never included the question about, well, how are you going to make things better for race relations and for opportunities for people of color in this country. And I just thought that was disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, it was really disturbing, right? I mean, it reminded me a little bit about what's going on with climate change, and sort of you have to try and persuade the deniers. It's the same thing you're saying here. And I want to also give a shout out to SEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic and Policy Research, which is co-sponsoring our event, because this book, I mean, I think it's just such a wonderful pairing between the Department of Communication and SEPR, because we are at the intersection of how to communicate all of these issues around economics. There's a few questions coming into the chat, which I'll get to in a minute. I see you, Amy and Thomas. You talk about how, okay, the good jobs went away for a lot of these people. Okay, they went to China. That's sort of been, there was NAFTA, there was China joining the WTO. But how much of the problem is discrimination? How much is it a failure to innovate and retrain people? The shift from a making things economy to a sharing economy, or are they all sort of part of the problem? Is there one that stands out, or they're equal?
It's all of it. So in the period after World War II, we reduced barriers to opportunity for women and for Black men. Though that reduction in discrimination paid huge benefits. 40% of per worker GDP since 1960 is attributable to that, which is enormous, just an enormous amount of economic growth that we got simply by letting people do things they should never have been stopped from doing in the first place. I mean, it's just really, when I talk to young people today, sometimes they don't believe me on this stat, but in 1960, like 95% of doctors and lawyers in America were white men. And there's no, if you believe in a normal distribution of talent among population, which I do, there's no reason for that other than, longstanding power dynamics. So we reduced that, we made it better, but we didn't finish the job. And so I think part of what's happened, particularly in the 80s and moving forward, is that the work of civil rights is left unfinished and in some ways starts moving backwards. There's a war on drugs under the Reagan administration that starts the mass incarceration of Black men in particular. But then another big thing that happens is that the entire structure of the economy shifts, and we don't keep up with policy that helps the workers who are best suited to adapt to that actually do it. And this is really a big story about women. We have moved from being a production economy because of a bunch of things, because of trade deals, because of automation, toward being a service economy. And women are, for an economy that demands more skill, more education, women are better positioned to meet those demands. They go to college at a higher rate than men. They have more skills sort of as a function of their standing in the population. And they should be the big winners from that shift. But we make it hard for them to do that because we don't, for example, provide widely available, affordable childcare in this country. And so women find themselves knocked out of the labor force to care for their children. They find it difficult to get back in. And then they still encounter residual sexism, just like, workers of color still encounter residual racism to getting ahead. And so all of those things combine to have an economy that, just sort of simply put, is just not nearly as good as it should be. And there's a lot of different things that you could do to goose our economy. Actually, the president did one of them. He poured a bunch of fiscal stimulus on an economy with an already low unemployment rate. I don't think that's very sustainable. I don't think that president after president can get away with running the kind of budget deficits that Donald Trump did at a 4.5% unemployment rate. But it's very sustainable to just make things equal for people. And so that's my argument here, is that if we can empower the workers who are still disempowered, still blocked from getting ahead in our economy by smart changes in policy, and also just by giving them more freedom to do what they're best at, they'll become the people who create the jobs, the good jobs that replace the jobs that went away through trade and automation, and they'll get paid more for whatever they do, because they'll be generating the kind of growth at low unemployment that leads to income gains.
I want to get to some of the techniques you use, Jim, in your storytelling here, but I want to ask a question about Ohio and immigration. Okay, you spent a lot of time reporting in Ohio. President Trump is still up, I think the last time I checked, by 2 to 4 percentage points in Ohio. So it's tight. I mean, it's close to the margin of error. But how are people sticking with him if he didn't really deliver? Maybe he did deliver, but it doesn't seem like he delivered on his promises there in terms of bringing back manufacturing jobs and whatnot. And one of the key things you say is that a place like Ohio, even before the factory jobs went away, tell me if I'm wrong, was failing to innovate. And one of the reasons they couldn't innovate was they didn't have any immigrants there, who are the people who actually drive these kinds of change. So the recipe, it seems to me you're saying, for a place like Ohio was let lots of immigrants come, immigrant students, immigrant entrepreneurs. And this is all happening at the very moment when this administration is trying to crack down on immigration, where Stanford itself is strongly opposing a new federal rule passed Friday that would limit international scholars from coming. Talk a little bit about that whole dynamic there about immigration, Ohio, and innovation, and why they still support Trump.
So I moved to Ohio in 2005. I had been, after Stanford, I worked at the Oregonian newspaper in Portland for a few years. Then I moved to Denver, Colorado, and worked at a newspaper there. And then I left Denver to go take the job as the lead political reporter at the Toledo Blade newspaper in Toledo, Ohio, which was a huge culture shock for me. I had never lived in the Midwest. I had never lived in a place where it was possible that the baseball scores on the West Coast would not make the next day's newspaper because of print deadlines. Fortunately, the internet, obscured that problem for me. But the thing I found in Ohio right away was, arguably no state in the country has been more impacted by the shifting composition of America's economy than Ohio. They'd been bleeding manufacturing jobs long before I got there, and even before the China shock, as economists call it, in the early 2000s. And every political discussion in Ohio started with, how will you get the good jobs back? Because I had neighbors who would tell me about the jobs at the Jeep plant in Toledo as sort of something that you hoped to pass down to your children. I worked the line, it's a good paying union job. I hope that someday my kid will replace me when I retire. It was a good job, and it was economic security for a lot of workers. And as those jobs went away, people were angry, and they got really disillusioned with the politicians who kept telling them they'd bring them back and didn't. So Trump comes along, and I think he gave them a different story. They had been told it was taxes, they'd been told it was unions, they'd been told a lot of different things. But Trump comes along and says, nope, you didn't do anything wrong. And this is, you workers didn't do anything wrong. You've been screwed over by our feckless political leaders who sold you out to China and Mexico and to the immigrants. And I think it's a very powerful political argument. Again, we've seen it a lot in American history. And, Ohio stampeded to Trump. The places that I covered in the 2006 election cycle that elected Democrats in a statewide sweep were the backbone of Trump's big electoral victories there. And I think they've stuck with him. I've been back a couple of times to talk to folks, not this last year. I haven't done any real on the ground reporting other than the forest fires since COVID hit. But I think a lot of folks are invested in the promises he made. I mean, I think the economy has been pretty good in Ohio. I think Trump's first 3 years were about as good as Obama's first 3 years of his second term and Bush's first 3 years of his second term. I mean, sort of a replacement level second term 21st century president. But they were pretty good, and people felt good about him. And I think that's it's hard. It's people feel invested in the brand. On the other hand, he's lost huge support in Ohio, and it's in play. He won it by a lot in 2016, and some polls have Biden up, some polls have Trump up, but it's really close. And so I think part of that is a recognition by some people that they were maybe sold a story that didn't turn out to be true. There have not been millions of jobs regained from Mexico and China that have come back to Ohio.
Yeah, that's also one of the things that hasn't changed, though. I mean, maybe some things were better, is that there doesn't seem to be higher wages. And so I keep wanting to get onto the journalism, but I have to come to this chilling. I mean, my students are working on their first assignment right now. They have to cover a meeting or a speech, and they have to go and find some news there, right? And then follow up and use it as grist for a story. And you take us in the book to a 2006 speech by Ben Friedman, right? A Harvard political economist, am I correct?
Yeah.
And so this is 2006, everyone, right? At the American Economic Association, where he talks about how the lack of rising wages was feeding Americans to turn violently against immigrants and undermining democratic foundations like the right to vote. Quote, and he warned of a coming chaos in American politics. Like, does he have a crystal ball? I mean, like, this is just playing out before our eyes right now, no?
Yeah, no, he did. I mean, and I think in retrospect, it seems really obvious. When people feel economically squeezed, they are more receptive to arguments about the people who are squeezing them, whether those arguments are true or not. Ohio, there's not really any real evidence that Ohio's economy has been made worse by immigrants. There's a lot of great evidence that immigrants improve economies across the country, including in Ohio, by bringing more entrepreneurship, more innovation, and even just more consumer demand from the lowest skilled, sort of economically speaking, immigrants. But it's a really easy story to tell about a finite pool of jobs being taken away. And Ohio, I think, just like the rest of the country, has been primed for a story like that by just decades of mediocre middle-class income growth. I mean, if you look at the 2000s, up until, for the bulk of the 2000s, we had just massively disappointing income growth for people in the middle. And I have a stat in the book that, there's basically one period in my lifetime, and I was born in the late 70s, one period in my lifetime when incomes have risen anywhere close to the pace at which they rose in the decades after World War II for the typical American. That was the late 1990s, the tech boom, when I happened to be at Stanford and not making money. But if we had just kept going with the income gains of the late 90s all the way through until now, instead of what we actually got, the typical American family would be making 50% more today than they actually are. And that is just a huge difference in lifestyle and the ability to own a home and buy a car and send your kids to college and save for retirement. I mean, it is a massive shortcoming of the way that the economy produces results for working people. And I think that absolutely has primed our country for the kind of political, turmoil we've seen now.
Chris Rios, who's our one of our journalism students, he's a medical fellow, so he's actually studying for his medical degree and learning health reporting as well. He's focusing on immigrants and undocumented immigrants this quarter. And he's wondering about, in the chat, about, which demographics are worse off in Chicago? Is it across the board, white, middle class, black middle class, Latinos? Do you happen to know the breakdown of this? Is anybody better off among those groups?
Among immigrants in
Oh,
Chicago?
among like the middle class, I think, and different demographics in general. Like, is there disparities there?
So I please don't quote me on this because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe Chicago tracks the country, which is that um, the definition of middle class is just different depending on your race or ethnicity. For white people, the typical white middle class person, just a middle class among white people, your income is significantly higher than someone who is middle class among Hispanic people or among Black people. And your wealth is dramatically higher if you're a typical white family's wealth is still, I believe, there's some new Fed statistics that came out this week. I think it's still 8 times larger than a typical Black family's wealth. I mean, it's so Chicago tracks those. If I recall correctly, I went to Chicago as part of the book, and it is a situation where depending on how you are slicing the universe of people within the city, what we see is that even the most struggling white neighborhoods still produce better outcomes at the medium for white people than like even mid-tier Black neighborhoods produce for the mid-tier Black person.
All right, let's get to the process here, the trade, my stuff now a little bit. And let's kick off with Amy DiPiero's question about your process of marrying economic research with on-the-ground reporting. What are the questions you ask yourself when you're reading these economic papers? And how do you deal with that tension around I mean, there's so much of this, right? In all social science and everything about two versions of what's happening to the middle class, right?
Yeah. Oh man, I have really strong feelings about this. So there are typically, like most journalism, like the really, really amazing journalism that I admire, typically falls into one of two categories. Just spectacular explanatory reporting about deep, like empirical work, whether that's data journalism that's done by the reporter herself or work that builds off, research done by economists or other researchers or whatever. But something that uses numbers and really, and even theory sometimes to really drive a really important observation about how, something works in America that has a policy implication. And then there are amazing narratives that tell you the stories of people who are struggling in certain ways, which are often totally divorced from those empirical studies. I mean, when I was at the Washington Post, I remember once, an editor telling me essentially numbers gum up good storytelling. So we try to keep them separate. This is in one particular team. This is not true of the whole Washington Post, but it's a way of thinking about narrative journalism. Is you would just want to tell a human story. You don't care exactly, what the numbers say. I try to put those two things together. I think it's important to tell stories about people who are indicative of larger trends. You can't and you shouldn't always encapsulate everything about a story in one person's narrative. I'm distrustful of people's stories that match up exactly with every single trend, out there in the country. And I don't have anybody that's a perfect character in this book. That's why there's so many characters. They tell different parts of the story. But I do feel really strongly that if you're going to tell someone's story, you need to tell me why it is important if you're going to make a policy argument about it, you need to tell me why they're indicative and not just an outlier. You can tell me an outlier story if that helps me to understand the actual trend. But so I start with the data because it's easier to find. The temptation is high if you have a great person to then try to like retrofit the data to their story. But if you start with the data and you say, okay, I know there's a universe of people who exemplify trend A or finding B, and I'm going to go out and talk to a bunch of them and see who has the most compelling story of those people. It actually, in some ways, it makes it easier. You are narrowing the universe of humans to talk to who might make good stories. In other ways, it makes it harder because some phenomenal stories come across your desk and they don't fit any trends and you end up not writing about them. But that is for the book and for what I try to do at the Times and other places that I've worked. That's what I try to do is to bring together human stories grounded in data that tell you something about policy.
Well, in the book, you talk about a study by two Stanford professors, or they were co-authors on it, which they updated in 2019. 2/5 of economic growth per capita in the US since 1960 came from tapping the talents of women and minorities. They actually quantify it. This is one of those things where it was like, I can't wait to hear what happens. And then you write 40% with an exclamation point, right? So here you come across a data point. So could you take something like this and actually do a story that illustrates this and find the
I did. Yeah, I did. I actually, I wrote about the very first version of their paper back when I was a magazine reporter at a publication called National Journal in Washington, where I had my first full-time economics reporting job in 2010. And I wrote, I think it was 2011 or 2012, I wrote a story where I used a bunch of their findings on it. And then I've just thought about it a lot, tossed it into some other stories. And then for this, the book really grows out of a series of stories I did while I was a reporter at the Washington Post that published in 2014. And I used their findings as sort of a backbone. And sort of interestingly enough, the story that illustrated them in that series didn't end up making it into the book. But I think that it was hard. It was a really big challenge to find someone whose life story, showed the progress of women or other minority groups in this country and how that was beneficial to everyone. Abstract concepts can be really hard, and a lot of economics papers are very abstract. But in this case, I just thought the idea was so powerful. The very first time I read that paper, I remember just being floored by the idea that something so intuitively amazing, wow, when we let people just operate without the restraints of discrimination, they do great things, and that's good for everybody. It seemed so intuitively true, but to see it like marked down on paper with equations behind it was pretty cool.
So one of the things you do, Jim, is a bit of self-reflection as well as a reporter with a very prominent job. A mea culpa on your coverage and the coverage by your colleagues of the 2016 election. And you recount how on election night in 2016, the headline of your story was how Trump won the revenge of working class whites. And you say that was correct, but quote, it fed a false narrative about workers, and that this was a myth that took root as a result of a lot of that reporting. And so talk about that blindness of the reporters who did it, whether you think it was perhaps a lack of diversity in newsrooms, or why was there that blind spot, and are reporters doing it better now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about me. I'm really calling me personally, and then people like me out on this. And I think it came from a good place, which was curiosity. 2015, Donald Trump surged to the top of the polls. Everybody thought he was just like a flash in the pan and he'd go away, and he didn't. He stuck around, and people started to have to take him seriously. And I had this crazy thought, well, maybe there's a policy reason behind this. Maybe he's speaking to something that no one else in the 600-person Republican field is speaking to right now. And so I went out to talk to a bunch of people, and I talked to we had a polling unit at the Post, which is a pretty awesome thing to have. And I asked them to poll, everything that they could find on sort of what people thought who also preferred Trump. And over the course of, we wrote several stories where we talked to people who supported him, and we polled this polling, and we assembled what I think was a really important picture of the sort of economic and cultural anxieties of Trump supporters who didn't like immigrants, who legal or undocumented, who didn't like refugees of any type, who had real pessimism for the future in the economy. They were, and when we wrote about why, I wrote a lot of stories about why those things work. There were good stories and helped, I think, explain why Trump was taking off. But I didn't also go out and write about the analogs to those people who weren't backing Trump. I mean, there were a lot of economically anxious people in America in 2015 and 2016, and people who had been stung by the recession and a slow recovery, people who were struggling in what was sort of a near second recession in 2015, and they were in particular, the black workers and the Hispanic workers who nobody thought would ever vote for Trump, and so we just didn't pay enough attention to them because we didn't think they were swing voters. And it turned out that was wrong. A lot of black voters in particular didn't turn out at all, and so they were swing voters of a turnout, don't turn out variety, and that's just as important. Their votes are just as important. We massively undercovered them. Cable news undercovered them. The New York Times undercovered them. The Washington Post undercovered them. Everyone undercovered them. But also, we gave white workers this crazy idea that they were alone and they're struggling. But all this attention on struggling white workers made them think they were different, and they weren't. American workers were struggling, all of them, and they were struggling together, and they were dealing with it in different ways. And they were experiencing slightly different things, but it was a struggle to be a middle-class American for such a long time after the recession ended. And instead of writing stories that might feed the idea that workers had some solidarity in that, we just wrote a bunch of stories that fed the idea that white workers were uniquely disadvantaged. And back to something you said earlier, by the time Trump was elected, like a majority of white Republicans in America thought that discrimination against white workers was a bigger problem than discrimination against black workers in the country. And there was no evidence for that. It was just a thing that came out of the political discourse, and one of those lies that politicians use to turn workers against each other. And we didn't do any of the work to tell a different story that people might have seen themselves in and locked onto.
There was a number that you threw in that just struck me. You actually you counted it up. 68 stories. This is in 2016. 68 stories that mentioned working class whites, and 4 that have working class blacks in them, and that included 2 book reviews. So just right to get a sense of just of how tough this was. I want to shift to a question from our colleague and friend Jay Hamilton about media economics question here, because in your book you do a wonderful job of illustrating the costs of economic inequality through people that you spend a lot of time with, and that kind of reporting takes resources, right, that perhaps local newsrooms really don't have anymore amid cutbacks, the pandemic and economic collapse. What stories, he'd like to know, do you worry the most about that are going untold because of the decline of local newsrooms? This may not be as much a problem with the New York Times, but nationwide.
No, I think about this all the time, and Jay and I have talked about this a bunch, and I think it's the right question. I mean, obviously, I think the thing that people who are trying to save local news have been correctly really focused on is investigative reporting. I worry a lot about, frankly, about states like California and my native Oregon that are essentially one-party governments right now that aren't getting a lot of scrutiny in the way that they might have in the past. In the same way I worry about Wyoming and South Dakota and sort of much more Republican states that aren't getting the scrutiny they used to get either. I think that it's a big important job of the press to hold politicians accountable to deliver for people and to not, to expose corruption and all those things. And I do think actually there's been a great movement in the last few years to try to fund investigative reporting sites that just are really focused on that. So now the next step down is that I worry there's almost no explanatory journalism about state policy to the degree that there should be. And there is, and newsrooms still do beautiful stories. I mean, I was saying, just covering the forest fires and was just in awe of the amazing local reporting that not just the Oregonian, my alma mater paper, did, but the Statesman Journal in Salem and a bunch of others was sort of telling narratives about people escaping the fires, or even in the Oregonians' case about communities, Latino communities who have been devastated and the economic losses they've suffered. But I just worry that there's just not enough firepower outside of major crises like forest fires for reporters to be telling those stories with anywhere close to the to the need that is out there. And I think a lot right now about the school story. There is a huge story with what's happening with education in this country right now. There's massive inequalities in the people who are able to afford private pods or who are able to send their kids to private schools, all of that. And then the people who are not able to send their kids to that, and their kids are struggling with remote learning because they don't have the technology resources, but B, just don't have the ability to be there, sort of bird dogging their kids because they've got to be off at work or whatever. And I just think it's a huge issue that we're trying to cover on a national level at the Times, but that every local newsroom, back when I was at the Oregonian, back in my day, kids, I was one of like 10 suburban education reporters. I covered 2 school districts. Now there's basically one person who covers all schools in the state of Oregon. And there's just not the room to do the depth and breadth of stories about all the different experiences that people are having with this massive change in education, which, by the way, has enormous economic effects for our country, for short-term and long-term. So I really worry about all that sort of stuff. And I think it's hard to argue that there is an right now, a viable economic model for that when there's not a viable economic model for the local restaurants that used to advertise in newspapers or whatever. So I worry about the economy, and I worry about the newspapers that are a huge important part of keeping people informed about the things in the economy. And it feels sometimes like it's in a really unfortunate death spiral right now. And I really hope we can find a way to pull it out.
Yeah, Jay, can you work on that? You gotta keep working on that to solve that problem.
It's Jay who's going to have to do it.
Jay's going to solve it. So let's talk about solutions here. You have a bunch of solutions in the book where you talk about we need to invest in people, in job training. We need to reduce discrimination, barriers, more parental leave. I mean, you've got sort of the textbook stuff, and then you hit the reader with like, but that's really not going to change anything, right? Let's be real, reader. And then you have this thing about we have to help each other.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, oh, that's good. I want to help someone, but I got to ask Jim what that means. So what does that mean?
So you're not supposed to give away the whole book, and I won't, but I am going to give away the most important thing in the book, which is, they ask you to have like a 10-point plan. Every book has to have a solutions chapter where you lay out. Usually it's something involving the earned income tax credit. Have to say that needs to be done, but I don't. I explicitly reject that in the book. I mean, I do lay out some policies that I think would be better, including, for example, Stanford University should double its enrollment of undergraduate students and use parts of its ginormous endowment to essentially seek out the best low-income students in the country. And
I saw that. Did you send that to Provost Drell?
I haven't yet. I mean, I'm sure
He's not busy at all right now. Don't worry. She's got plenty of time. No, there's nothing going on here.
Yeah, but I think it would make a small difference on the margins if Stanford and every other elite school in the country did that. It would make a huge difference if, like, we as a society invested in those students to get them all, high-end human capital educations from the get-go. But none of that's actually going to, add up to everything we need. And so I can't believe I'm about to say this, but it's true. I think that both the easiest and most daunting way to create a sustainable economy where we have continued increases in productivity and continued economic growth that is much faster than we've seen, and the kind of income growth that lifts people into middle class and helps them afford their own homes and everything else, the way to do it is to end systemic racism and sexism, which is basically like saying, yeah, well, sure, if we can just, perfect nuclear fusion, we'll be fine with this climate change thing. But it's a thing we've made progress on in the past. We don't actually have to perfect it tomorrow, but we need this sort of national dedication to it. It's an economic strategy. It's also a social justice strategy. So much of this book is informed kind of by both a combination of my economics reporting and my own sort of sense of social justice that's been infused in me since I was a kid. But I think it's really important to note that they are not at odds here. That if we do what's right by people, if we fulfill the promise of America to everyone in America, true opportunity for all that is blind to your race and your gender and the economic circumstances at which you start your life, we really could deliver that. we would have a much better America. We'd have a much better economy. We'd have a much more stable society. The research is really clear on what a big, vibrant middle class does for democracies. It's great. Um, and I think it's part of the reason why our democracy is struggling right now and showing these signs of strain is because our middle class has for so long shown these kinds of strain. So yeah, it's and I acknowledge in the book it's really not an easy thing to do. But quoting Bill Wu,
Especially, Jim, as you write that you say we must do this even at a time when we have Trump, who's made it harder by inflaming racial hatred. And as Ted Glasser points out in the chat, this whole thing last night where Biden referred to, he seemed to when Biden referred to rotten apples in police departments, maybe he completely misunderstood this too. Like, it may not only be a Trump thing. Like, we still need to, like we said earlier, persuade the country of systemic racism, or is it forget the federal leadership and let's turn to the corporations and other actors to do the right thing here? I mean, there's some
all of it. We need all of it. We need leaders at the very top of the government who set a good example and say, this is important. This is real. This is a problem. We can all solve it, and it will be better for all of us if we do it. I mean, we need that from the top, but we can't, like, I've lived in Washington for too long now and seen too many people come and go, disappointing the people who put them in office, thinking that they alone could fix it. Right? It's not just Trump. People had those hopes for Obama, and he didn't deliver the kind of systemic change that people had hoped. And it's because we have to demand more than just one politician to solve these problems. We have to do it in our own lives. We have to start by, I mean, I have asked myself and my newsroom hard questions since I started working on this book. There are no excuses anymore, I don't think, for newsrooms for not making, not succeeding. It's not enough to make an effort anymore diversifying our newsrooms. We need to succeed at it. And it's not enough just to hire a diverse pool of people. We need to promote them. They need to be running newsrooms and involved in coverage decisions. One reason why I think that the news in general has done much better in the coverage of Black workers in this cycle than in 2016 is because we have more Black political reporters who've been pushing for it. And that's a really great thing. And we need more of it. And we need white reporters to be pushing more for it too. So, I mean, I just think it all feeds on itself. And so we should start at home. We should all start at home and really challenge ourselves to be better at this, to ask yourself, am I opening opportunities for people around me? And then we should demand it of our political leaders to open opportunities for people who don't necessarily look like us. And we should not be afraid of that. We should not be afraid that if other people get ahead, that means I'm not going to, because, I think the history is really clear that when we all get ahead, we all get ahead.
Well, I want to end it there on that uplifting note, because there's a lot of just sort of bad news going around. And let's hope that we can find a way to have a national commitment to helping each other, as you write really lovely in this book. And I want to know, I talked a lot about the book, everyone, but I didn't even tell any of the stories of the characters. I didn't tell the story about the story he didn't publish. So all my students on the call are going to have to buy the book and read it, and then send notes to Jim. Jim, they can write to you, right?
Yeah. Please, all of you, students, professors, community members, I love hearing from folks who've read it. I would love to hear from you. If you run a class and want to assign the book, I'm excited about that as well. But really, truly, I just think the ideas are really worthy of discussion, and would love to continue it with all of you.
Jim, I wish more than anything that you could have been with us on the farm. I wish that I could be on the farm, but it's great to see you remotely, and I look forward to seeing you in DC or here in California, hopefully soon. Thank you to everybody who took the time to tune in. Signing off here from Redwood City. Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, everyone.